Hello and welcome to today's talk on the paradox of the women's game. My name is Dr. Ashley Rogers and this presentation today is based on research conducted by Professor Samantha Punch, Dr. Miriam Snellgrove and me on gender equality in bridge. Now I'll firstly begin by providing a bit of an insight into the research that we conducted and the methods that we used to gather the data that's informed this presentation. Secondly, I'll highlight some of the key findings from our research, which today centre on bridge players' opinions and views on the women's game. And thirdly, I'll highlight the paradox of the women's game by summarising the complexities and debates that surround it and how broader patriarchal structures of society can be revealed in an exploration of the existence of women's bridge. Now, this research was focused on engaging with opinions and experiences of gender equality in bridge. Now, the initial aim was to explore players' understandings of the term sexism and whether or not they believed it was a relevant term to describe any of their experiences within the bridge community, and, if yes, whether or not they believed that any changes were perhaps needed with regards to equality in the game. So in order to reach as many people as possible, we chose to use email questionnaires. Now, the email questionnaire consisted of 8 qualitative questions, so meaning that there were no closed answer questions. At the end, it also asked if there was anything else that participants wished to add. So bridge players were able to provide whatever length of answers that they wished, and some it was a few sentences, some a couple of paragraphs, and for some it was a page or so long. We didn't constrain bridge players in the length of their response at all. And overall, we had responses from 151 bridge players from across the world, and we documented their ages, their level of play, and their geographical location. The original research team consisted of myself and Sam, so Sam, a bridge player, and me not, despite Sam's insistence that I should play, and my weak attempts a couple of years ago. Once I had anonymised the data, we then set about analysing it using a process of thematic analysis. Our analysis wasn't just based on the questions that we asked, but we were also open to other issues and themes that might emerge from the data, things that bridge players themselves had brought up. And in fact, it's here that we recognised a really strong theme emerge from the data with regards to the women's game. And the aspect of the women's game was mentioned by almost all respondents. So let's take a wee look at what some of the bridge players had to say with regards to women's bridge. So here I include a few quotations from the data. I'm just going to let you read them. These quotations are selected because they reflect the broader data set, so they represent the themes and ideas that emerged from the data. Players' responses across the questionnaire illustrate that the situation of women's only events is complex. So on the one hand, they're considered to reinforce sexism, difference, and give the impression of a two-tier system of play and of skill. On the other hand, though, they're also considered as really important spaces for women to develop and compete in a less pressured arena that's relatively free of the sexism that they might have experienced or that's faced inside and outside of the bridge community. It affords them some of these opportunities that might not be afforded to them otherwise. So at international level, there's no game that's just for men. So the existence of women's only events was often suggested to be a form of sexism in and of itself in favour of women. And although comments of this nature were largely from male players, women did express this concern too. That in the name of gender equality, women and men should have the same. And although this perception in this situation on the surface is quite understandable, much of it's perhaps down to a misunderstanding of what gender equality really means. And maybe this is where I can use the term equity instead. It might be a better use here just to explain. So the treatment of men and women might indeed be different, but what the overall aim is gender equality, because these differences are actually taking into consideration and compensating for biases and other structural conditions of society that have meant that one, for example, social group needs something different than the other. So therefore, it's an acknowledgement that different social groups might need different types of support or access to opportunities in order to achieve success. And overall, that's what leads to gender equality. And indeed, as you can see from the quotes, it's considered that there's a women's only category because maybe it's just needed to accommodate different access to opportunities for success and different skill levels. And these were often two factors that respondents linked together: access to opportunities and level of skill. And many women suggested that in order to succeed at high levels, there really needs to be a women's only game. And these views tended to be expressed in conjunction with a belief that there's a difference in skill level between men and women players, and that the mere existence of a women's category itself just simply reinforces that. Now, although it was suggested by some that the existence of women's bridge is related to skill, many women also expressed that there were actually just fewer opportunities to develop skills in a game, especially when it felt a little bit like an old boys' club. But with their perception that women are lower skilled players anyway, then they expressed that it was just difficult to move to the women's game, from the women's game, and into the open. Now, men's success then, and the idea that they're better, wasn't just linked to them having access to more opportunities, but it was also linked to the identification of certain characteristics that were also considered to have afforded them greater success. And these were things like being more competitive, more aggressive, more able to concentrate than women, that they were more able to move on if something was to go wrong in the game, that they tend to feel less pressured, that they're able to be more single-minded about their pursuits. And much of this is considered to be through processes of social learning and performing the way that men and women are expected to in society. But it's also about the way that society determines and constrains them too. So I will point out that a few bridge players did also suggest that men's brains and women's brains are just quite simply wired differently. And therefore, there's a bit of a turn to some physiological and biological reasons. Now, we've actually addressed and debunked this idea elsewhere. And yes, eventually there might be some subtle differences between men and women, but a lot of this is largely down to society. When we're born, we are not wired differently. But overall, there were suggestions that the goal for bridge players was to play like a man, and that in fact, she plays bridge like a man is often used as a compliment, as you can see here, as expressed by one female international player. So overall, our key findings are that women's only bridge seems to create a two-tier system of play, and that just reinforces the perception that women are weaker players. That many women who responded to our questionnaire believe that the women's game provided them with opportunities that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. And something I haven't covered already is that women and younger men were more likely to recognise the broader conditions of society that affect not only perceptions of women and their skill, but also ideas about the women's game. Now, the aim of this presentation isn't to engage with age as a factor here, but I include it because it did emerge in the data with regards to those who engaged with the differences between men and women in experiences of life, of expectations and social learning, of the people that identified the other responsibilities that women often have, childcare, other time constraints. And while the majority of male and female bridge players who mentioned women's bridge in their responses did suggest that the women's game should be abolished, it was still a suggestion that came largely from men. Many women actually expressed concern that it might end up a space that would no longer exist for them. And interestingly, the biggest reason that was presented for abolishing women's bridge is that it would change people's perceptions of women. And this, for me, is a bit of a chicken and an egg one. Can people really not change their perceptions and increase their awareness without getting rid of women's bridge? Or does women's bridge really need to go for that to happen? And so where women were concerned, this is best perhaps summed up by one female tournament player who states, "I'm in two minds about segregated events. They simultaneously give females more opportunities at one end and limit them at the other." So what is clear from the data is that there emerged two sides to the discussion of women's bridge and its existence, but that these two sides were complex, intertwining, and perhaps unable to be resolved. And so this is where we have a paradox. The women's game is often considered to be exclusionary, sexist, and part of the problem. And yet at the same time, it's also enabling, it's inclusive, and it's perhaps also part of the solution. And so I end here highlighting that this paradox, these complexities, and perhaps also some of the misunderstandings, for example, around gender equality and what it actually means, are rooted in the broader patriarchal structures and ideologies, some of which I've listed here, and all of which came from the data, and all of which are signs of patriarchy. So what the data overall reveals is that when it comes to the women's only game, it might be harnessed as an either-or debate, as a help or hindrance for women's bridge players, but in fact, it's not as clear-cut as this. And what we need to do is consider the broader societal aspects, the gender constructions, the roles and relations. And when we do, we see that women's bridge can actually be both. It can be both a help and a hindrance. Patriarchy, sexism, these don't just exist out there, outside of bridge, but these ideologies about and structural constraints on women influence the bridge world too, and women's participation and belonging within it. And men and women are both complicit in some of this. So do we really rely on removing women's bridge to change broader structures and perceptions? Or can't we be more aware, more understanding, and more open to the differential experiences of men and women bridge players in and out of bridge? And, in turn, why those differences and spaces might then exist. Because the problem with positioning the women's game, a space for women, as the problem, simply sustains and reinforces gender inequalities and just reveals the very patriarchal attitudes and structures that in seeking to achieve gender equality, people are really starting to and should be moving away from. So I leave you with those thoughts and thank you very much for tuning in to today's talk. Take care.